Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, the research endeavor. And I know I just heard a groan from a lot of you. A lot of you probably don't love research. But research is actually the most important part of psychology, because without research we really wouldn't know that a lot of these things are actually true. And so you'll be reading about a lot of phenomena, and I want you to be able to understand the language that's used. And for those of you who are going on in psychology, at the master's and doctoral level, you'll be doing a lot of research, and those of you who are even taking it here at John Jay will probably take Psychology 311, where you'll be learning to conduct your own research, and so these things will be coming up over and over again. So we're going to talk about the scientific method, case studies, correlational studies, epidemiological studies, experimental studies, genetic studies, cross-cultural research, and meta-analysis. So you've probably learned a lot of this stuff in high school about the scientific method and the different steps involved. So the first step is defining a problem and stating a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is an educated guess. So the hypothesis is a statement predicting what can happen in the study. So what you do is, when you define your problem, you've conducted the research and you've seen what other people have done. Therefore, you form a theory and you hypothesize what you believe will happen based on what's been done before. You also will then have a null hypothesis, which is the prediction that there's no relationship between a phenomena and the statement. Therefore, therefore we can always falsify the hypothesis, so there's a way to disprove it. We then need to choose and implement a method to answer the question that we've asked, and this is where the kind of research design and statistics come into play. So we want to look at our variables, which are the factors or characteristics that can vary among samples. And then we will determine the dependent and independent variables. The dependent variables are the factors that can be predicted. So we're looking at, if we're looking at the relationship between nutrition and height would be our outcome variable, or our dependent variable, and our independent variable would be the manipulated variable, or the variable that's different between our groups. And so some people would have very good levels of nutrition, some people would have very poor, and we would speculate that, based on the research that we did, that those people who had good nutrition would have greater increases in height. And so we also have to operationalization, pardon me if I could speak, and that kind of talks about how we're going to measure these variables. So if we're talking about nutrition, how are we going to measure nutrition? Is there a scale? Are we going to measure caloric content? Are we going to measure vitamin content? So it's very important to define exactly how you're going to measure these things. In terms of height, how are we going to measure that? Is it going to be in inches gained? Is it going to be in total height, etc., etc.? And then we have to collect and analyze the data. And based on the data, after we do our analysis, we draw conclusions and document the results. So when we do research, there are definitely ethical issues that we have to keep into account. You probably in your 101 class learned all about research that could possibly be unethical, like shocking people, or the Milgram's Milgram study where the people were receiving fake shocks, but people thought they were administering real shocks, or Zimbardo's prison experiment. Those things probably wouldn't pass the ethics review board today. So we have to make sure that they're the basic rights of all participants in the studies, and we have each university has its own ethics review board, and before any research can be approved, it has to go through this ethics review board where they kind of vet everything to make sure it's correct and that we're not going to be hurting anybody. And there's usually, on these ethics review board, in addition to people who conduct research, there are also representatives of the public, and usually there's like a priest or some kind of other public advocate on the IRB committee. We also want to make sure that the participants understand the study, that their responses are going to be confidential. Generally they're not anonymous, because sometimes we have information about them. Sometimes they are anonymous, but usually by signing the consent form, at least we have some identifying information on them, but we have to agree to maintain confidentiality. That people have the right to refuse to participate in research, or they can withdraw their participation with no consequence to themselves. That people are given informed consent, and so they agree to participate in the study after hearing about all the risks and benefits. They should not be deceived into the study, so while deception can occur if it's in the benefit of science and the person doesn't get very much, there's no real psychological trauma taking place, so they have to be debriefed, which is the next step. But generally we cannot trick people into participating in the study. They need to have informed consent. and everybody should be debriefed as to the purpose of the study and any contact information for resources and help resources at the end of the study. So case studies are one way of doing research, and they're detailed histories of individuals who've suffered from some sort of psychological disorder. So the Phineas Gage example would be a perfect example of a case study. So we understand the experiences of single individuals to make a general inference, and so we look at one case and we kind of make generalizations about this. It gives us an opportunity to study very rare problems, but it can't be generalized, which means that based on looking at one person's experience, we can't say that all people who have had a railroad stake through their heads will behave and have the same outcome as Phineas Gage. That was just in his case. And oftentimes they lack objectivity because they are about one person in general. So those are kind of the disadvantages of case study. The case studies can be used for theory testing, and so if you see it once, you can make theories about it and then test it in more people. Another good thing about case studies is that it can help you learn and provide a lot of detail. So, for example, if you're trying a novel therapy, you can do a case study of how one person reacts and provide transcripts, so that people who are doing your therapy in the future will have a sense of what some of the challenges they might incur are. So correlational studies examine the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable without manipulating either one. So this is kind of the relationship, looking at the relationship between weight and height. So we haven't manipulated either one of those, but we just look to see that as people's weight increases, so does their height. So that's a positive correlation. So there are different kinds of correlational studies. There are continuous variables. So two or more variables are measured and the correlation is examined. So we have variables that have more than one answer. So it's not just yes or no, it's your level of satisfaction on a 5-point scale and your happiness measured on a 10-point scale. So both of those are continuous variables. Dichotomous variables would be something like, are you happy? Yes, no. So that way it wouldn't be a continuous variable. Group comparison studies are when two or more groups are compared on variables of interest. So it might be looking at males and females and the quality of their life satisfaction to see if there's a difference between those two groups. Cross-sectional studies means that we're looking at participants at one point in time, and so we're kind of, if I do a survey, that's cross-sectional research because I'm not looking at your behaviors over a longer period of time. I'm looking at it at one moment in time, which can provide me some information. However, we don't know if this phenomenon is an artifact of, like, perhaps, for example, if I was measuring depression on 9/11, people might experience more symptoms of depression than normal, or they would have been, very distressed that day. However, if I measured a year later or 2 years later, the levels of depression wouldn't be the same, but it was because of an artifact of that situation. So the only way you can get over that is doing a longitudinal design where you follow people at 2 or more points over time to see kind of patterns and trends. So the correlation coefficient is the number that or the statistic that we use to assess the degree to which two variables are correlated. It's represented by the little letter R, and correlations fall anywhere between -1 and +1. Positive correlations mean that as the value of one variable increases, so does the value of the other increase. So if we're looking at happiness and quality of life, we would think that as people's quality of life increases, so does their level of happiness. So that's a positive correlation. And a correlation of both positive or -1 is a perfect correlation, means that the two variables vary together 100%, like in the same direction. A zero correlation means that there is absolutely no relationship between the two variables. So a negative correlation, which would be a -1 correlation, means that as values of one variable increase, the values of the other variable decrease. So it would be something like the numbers of hours of sunlight decreasing results in increased sweater wearing, for example. So as one decreases, the outdoor temperature decreases, we see an increase in the number of people wearing sweaters. So that would be a negative correlation. So if you look at the figures here, the one on the top left is a positive correlation. would be a correlation of +1, because you can see that there's a one-to-one relationship, that as the independent variable increases, so does the dependent variable. The one on the top left. Top right is a perfect negative correlation, because as one decreases, the other one increases in a perfect linear combination. You kind of look to which direction the line would fall, and that tells you whether it's a positive or negative correlation. So you can see on the one on the left would fall to on the positive axis, and the one to the left on the right would fall to the negative axis. So it's a negative correlation. I think I probably just fully confused you, but I hope you understand. If not, please email me. So if you look at the number C, there is absolutely no correlation, because if you had to draw a line through that, you'd see that it wasn't necessarily, it would be straight, it would be horizontal, perpendicular to the x-axis. So that would be a 0 correlation, so those two variables are not related at all. And the one on the right would be a positive correlation, but not a perfect correlation, because as the two variables, if you drew a line through that, it would not be a perfect fit. So statistical significance is the index of how likely a result is due to chance. And so in psychology, we use probability of 0.05. So we say that anything if there's greater than a 95% chance that it's actually due to the variables we're manipulating, or the difference between those two groups is true, and there's a 5% chance that it's due to chance, and we accept that as kind of fine. So you might hear about statistical and clinical significance, but those things aren't necessarily mean the same thing. So we can do our statistics, and we can find a statistical significant result, which means that there's only a 5% chance that it happened by chance alone, that 95% of it is probably, there's a 95% chance that it's due to the difference actually between the two variables. But even then, like, so if we have a very large sample, it might be the difference between a score of 12 and a score of 14 on the BDI, which statistically is significant. However, clinically, somebody who scores 12 on the BDI and somebody who scores 14 are both scoring in the mild levels of depression, and we probably clinically would not notice any difference between those two individuals. So correlation versus causation, you've probably heard this, but correlation does not imply causation. Just because two variables are related doesn't mean that they really have anything to do with one another. You often see this in the media. They've misinterpreted research. And so just because two variables vary together doesn't mean it could be due to a third variable. And so there might be some other variable that caused those first two variables to be related. So it could be people born in, could be the temperature outside and the height of people born in 1973. However, really, it had nothing to do with that people in 1973 are taller. However, it had nothing to do with being born in 1973. Perhaps that was the year that some new, vitamin was introduced, and a lot of people took it, which then increased height, so it had nothing to do with the temperature at all, if that makes sense to you. So when we do research, we have to select a sample, because we cannot do research on all 5 billion people on the earth, and so we have to select a sample to represent those 5 billion people on the earth and to make comparisons. So whatever we do, we try to make a representative sample such that the people that we are researching represent the people to which we're trying to generalize these results to. So generally here in North America, we do research on people in North America, but if we're trying to generalize our findings to a more global audience, we'd want to sample people from all across the world. We want to also, if we're trying to generalize to both men and women, it would be silly to just do experiments on only women or only men. We'd want to have both in our sample. You also want to make sure that the age is representative, and that you don't sample only 18-year-olds and try to then generalize to people who are 65, as well as people of different race and ethnic backgrounds, because if you only sample white people or only sample black people, it's unclear if those results would apply to people of different races or cultures. There are other important variables that might come into play, like socioeconomic status, geographic region, etc., education level. And group comparison studies compare the experiences of one group to those of another. So sometimes we might look across variables like ethnicity, gender, age, etc. And so when we evaluate correlational studies, we want to make sure that they have good external validity, which is the extent to which the study's results can be generalized to real-life phenomenon. And so, using longitudinal studies, we can actually determine differences in groups before an event occurs. And so if you're following, for example, if we were following people prospectively, we could see, if we started following them in 2005, we could see how September 11th influenced people and who had more positive trajectories afterwards and who had more negative trajectories afterwards. And therefore we could make more causal, by looking at them across time. And after a certain point, we could say that 9/11, affected these types of people this way and these types of people this way. However, the disadvantage is that it's very time consuming. It's very hard sometimes to indicate cause and consequence, and we have the third variable problem, such that whenever we find a relationship, we don't necessarily know that that's due to those two variables. It could be due to something else. So epidemiological studies are those that are kind of done by people like the CDC. So they study the frequency of a distribution of a disorder, which focuses on different types of data, including the prevalence, so the proportion of the population that experiences a certain disorder. So you can say that, let's say, 15% of the population will experience depression at some point in their lifetime. Incidence is an occurrence within a specific period of time, so we can say that the one-year incidence of depression is 2%, so this year 2% of the population will experience clinical depression, but over a lifetime it may be 15% of all people. And risk factors are conditions associated with increased likelihood of occurrence of a problem. And they give clues of risks that can occur. So the epidemiological studies share some limitations with correlational studies, as they cannot establish that any risk factor causes a disorder. We just know that they're associated. And third variables may explain the relationship between any risk factor and the rates of a disorder. So if we see, for example, in a certain population that they have higher levels of OCD, we can speculate that the geographic location is related, but there might be some other factor like some pollutant, or there may be a genetic mutation or something else that would be causing that to be. So experimental studies are studies where the independent variable and potentially problematic third variable are controlled, and so rather than observing them naturally. So we usually do this in lab studies, therapy outcome studies, and single case experimental designs. So human lab studies involve exposing participants to an event in the laboratory and then determining its impact. So we're controlling a lot of it. So for example, like I study suicide, and there's no way that I can obviously induce suicide in somebody, so I wouldn't be able to use this type of experiment. But if you are doing eyewitness testimony research, you can, control the conditions that the people receive, and then based on the manipulation, you can make determinations on how people respond. So there are things that we need to consider when doing lab studies, and those are internal validity, so that we can make sure that the changes in the dependent variable are attributed to the manipulation of the independent variable. We want to make sure that that's measured accordingly, that we have a control group, so participants all have the same experiences, but we have one group where we change something and one group that we stay constant. So this, in a drug trial, for example, would be the placebo condition, where people get sugar pills and other people get medication, and therefore we attribute any change in people's outcome to the medication. We would subtract the placebo from the experimental group. The experimental group are participants that have the same experiences as the control group, but they're also given the manipulation. So in order for a study to be internally valid, we have to have random assignments. So that means that we kind of go like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and assign people to groups such that, in some cases, like my research, I'd have to have naturally occurring groups, like people who made suicide attempts and those who didn't. But in experimental research, we want to minimize those kind of differences and make sure that people are kind of on average the same as they possibly can be, and we do that by randomly assigning them to groups. So threats to internal validity can be demand characteristics such that participants guess the purpose of the study and thus change their behavior accordingly. So that's why we try, sometimes people use deception in their research so people don't know what the hypothesis being tested is. And we have double-blind experiments where both the subject and the experimenter do not know what condition the subject is in. You see this a lot in drug trials, so that the person administering the medication doesn't know whether they're giving them a sugar pill or the actual study medication, because they may treat the patient differently if they know they're giving them a study medication. or a sugar pill. Even if they don't mean to, it might be inadvertent, so this way they don't have any idea. So some of the advantages of lab studies are that the researcher has more control over the variables, the participants can be randomly assigned to groups, and there's appropriate control groups can be assigned to can be created to rule out alternative explanations of important findings. The disadvantages include results may not generalize outside the laboratory, and there might be some ethical limitations in that we can't, for example, if we have a treatment, and we may not be able to give it to some people and not others. So we also try to use the experimental method when doing therapy outcome studies so that we can show that one treatment is better than another one. And so we also want to show that the treatment reduces symptoms or the problem that we're trying to reduce in the individuals who receive it. So one way to do that is using, but obviously, we have to be ethical when we do this, and so one way to do that is a waitlist control, such that we give one group the intervention, and another group is on a wait list to get the intervention, but they haven't received the intervention yet. And so we then hypothesize that any differences between the two groups before and after the intervention in the experimental group is due to the intervention itself. At the end of the study, assuming the intervention works, then the people in the waitlist control group would also get the intervention. We also have sometimes a placebo control group, and so these people have the same interaction with the experimenters as the participants in the experimental group, but take pills that are inactive substances. So we know that just by the sheer fact that people are participating in a study, they often have an improvement in their symptoms. That's known as the placebo effect. So just by saying to somebody, we have a pill for depression, and participate in this study and giving them a sugar pill, even though it has no active ingredients, people's symptoms of depression will decrease. But we want to know how much of that decrease is actually due to the medication and how much is due to the placebo effect. So we give one group the medication, one group the placebo, and then we subtract one effect from the other, and the difference between the two is supposed to be due to the experimental drug. So that way we take into account the placebo. And if there's no difference between the two of them, then the experimental drug doesn't have any effect above and beyond the placebo effect. So one of the advantages of therapy outcome studies is that it helps provide help to people in distress as research is generated. But the disadvantages are that because therapies are so comprehensive, it's hard to tell us specifically what element of the therapy led to the reduction in psychopathology. There's also a lot of questions about the appropriateness of control groups. So, is it fair to give people a placebo pill? Is it, is a waitlist control group adequate? There are ethical considerations such that, can we let people wait to get treatment by putting them on this waitlist control group even though they eventually get it, so that they must experience distress longer if we have a treatment that works. And so we need to balance their needs with the needs to administer standardized treatment. Because we want to make the treatments as standardized as possible, but oftentimes, people have individual needs, and if we deviate from the protocol, therefore they have to be excluded from the trial. And the generalizability of results to real-world delivery of therapy is unclear, because often these treatment studies are done kind of within university clinics where people are highly trained and monitored and whatever else, but then when we take it out into the real world, into clinics, etc., people don't have the same training, they don't have the same supervision, and therefore the integrity of the therapy is not what it was, and we don't see the same results. Another way to test treatment effects are single-case experimental designs. This is often known as the AB design. It's often seen with behavioral interventions. So you would give somebody an intervention, you would withdraw it, and then see if their behavior returns back to normal, and then you would reinstate it, and then you would take it away again and see if it goes away. So this is used, for example, like if you were giving a kid a reward for on-task behavior. So you would introduce the reward for on-task behavior. We would see a decrease in the amount of yelling that the kid experiences. We take away the reward, we would expect the yelling to increase. We introduce the reward again, we would expect the yelling to decrease. We take the reward away again, and then we would expect it to increase. And therefore, we could have causal inferences based on the addition and subtraction of this one intervention to see if it could work. Multiple baseline designs are an intervention that might be given to the same individual but at different settings or to different individuals at different points in time, and therefore you could make causal conclusions that way. Animal studies are when we expose animals to situations in laboratories that it would not be ethical to impose on humans. We have more controls over laboratory conditions and third variables than in human laboratory studies, obviously, because there are things that people have done to animals, and we can debate that ethicality obviously another day, but that we definitely could not do on humans. One of the huge issues is that there are ethical issues with testing on animals, and a lot of people feel very strongly that this is not ethical. However, we've learned a lot of stuff from testing on animals that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And it's also unclear how much of there's generalizability between animals and humans. So even if we get a result in a rat, for example, does that mean that we'll get the same result in a human? What we'll learn about when we study depression is about Seligman's learned helplessness theory. And that's when we basically learned about how people become hopeless. A dog was in a box where one side was shocked, and we used to let him, there would be a warning light before the shock would be administered, and then he could jump over a fence into an area where there would be no shock. And so the dog quickly learned that with the warning light to jump over the fence. However, in another part of the study, there was really no relationship between the light and the shocks. And the dog just got shocked at random periods of time, not related to the light, and the dog just stopped trying to jump over the fence and just became kind of helpless or hopeless. And that's what Seligman postulated about people who were really depressed, is that they had this kind of not related reinforcement schedule. Therefore, even if they tried really hard, they would still fail, so they just kind of give up. Genetic studies identify genetic factors associated with psychopathology. So one of the things that we're going to learn about this semester is there are a lot of biological predispositions for certain psychological disorders. And they investigate the degree to which genes play a role in the particular disorder or its heritability through family history studies. So they look at people, like they do genome studies where they actually kind of map family, like who has the disorder, who doesn't. Throughout the person's history. So you can see with patients with schizophrenia, for example, where there's a high heritability that many people in the family tree might have had or had some disorder similar to schizophrenia. With twin studies, whereby people, we look at the concordance between monozygotic and dizygotic twins who share different degrees of genetic material but very similar environments. And then we look at adoption studies whereby we have twins that one is adopted at birth or they're separated at birth, and then we look at how much the environment comes to play, and whatever is the same between them we attribute to being to genetics. So, as I mentioned, family history studies identify people who have the disorder. They identify a control group of a family who doesn't have the disorder, and they trace the family pedigrees of individuals with these two groups and see how many relatives have the disorder. Adoption identifies people with the disorder who are adopted shortly after birth, and they determine if the rates of disorder are different among biological relatives of the adoptees or adoptive relatives of the adoptees. And we would think that people we would think there's a lot more similarity if there's a genetic predisposition to those who are biologically related versus the adopted family. But if we see no difference, then we could say that the environment played a role. So when we do this, we know that monozygotic twins have 100% of genes in common. Parent and child, full siblings, and dizygotic twins have 50% of their genetic material in common. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and half-brothers and sisters have 25% of their genetic material in common. And then great-grandparents, great-grandchildren, whatever, have 12.5% of their genetic material in common. So we would expect to see higher prevalences of these disorders in people who have more genetic material shared, because if it was a more genetically based disorder. Molecular genetic studies compare the DNA of a group of people who have a disorder with a group of people who don't have the disorder. They're also called association studies. And then we do a linkage analysis where we look for other characteristics that are known to occur with the disorder and have known genetic markers. So, for example, if blue eyes co-occur with OCD, well, we don't know exactly what to look for OCD, but if we know that people who have blue, this is not true, I'm just making this up, but people who have blue eyes tend to have more OCD. Therefore, we know the genetic marker for blue eyes, and we could kind of trace that and then look for linkages there. One of the other things that we have to consider with our research is racial and ethnic differences and how that applies cross-culturally, cross-racially, etc. Because we know that there are a lot of similarities between different cultures, but we also know that there are differences. And so one of the things that we do when we conduct research is try to increase the generalizability. And so we want to see as much as possible how much of these things are co-occurring cross-culturally. So there's a lot of challenges with this because things mean different things in different cultures. For example, depression, as we talked about earlier, can be manifested more somatically in the meaning that the physical symptoms are expressed more closely in Asian cultures and more cognitively, or saying like I'm feeling more depressed, I'm feeling more hopeless in Western cultures. And so just the concept of depression might vary between the cultures. A lot of the assessment tools are difficult to translate across cultures, so just simply translating, for example, the Beck Depression Inventory may not be appropriate. We have to make sure that it's normed in different populations. There might be cultural or gender differences in people's responses to the social demands of interacting with researchers. For example, cross-culturally there may be different roles of men and women. If I was in a very male-dominated society as a female researcher, men may respond very differently to me in those societies than they may in America. And researchers label one culture as healthy and the other culture as unhealthy, but that's not necessarily true. It's just that they have different values. And this is when we talked about what is abnormal psychology. This very much comes into play. One method of looking at data that tries to overcome a lot of the limitations of previous research is the meta-analysis. And it's really a statistical technique for summarizing results across several studies. So you'll see when you do research that you have like study A looked at this, study B looked at this, study C looked at this, and there's a lot of similarity and overlap. But what the meta-analysis does is it takes the data from all those studies, or any study that has looked at the phenomenon, puts it together in one big pot, and then does an analysis of all the outcome data. So let's say you have, 14 studies that are in favor of A, 15 studies that are in favor of B. The meta-analysis would take all 29 studies, combine them in a big pot, and look at what the overall effect is. And so it looks at the average effect size across studies and relates to the characteristics of the study. So it overcomes the problems resulting from small numbers of participants, because sometimes we don't have enough power or enough participants in our study to make accurate conclusions. So it gives us more power to find statistically significant effects. But the disadvantage is sometimes, it depends on how people are defining their variables. Not all the studies have all the information that it's needed. And there's also the file drawer effect, because oftentimes if people don't find any results, they don't publish their data. And so unless you know who's doing the research and you can get them to give you data sets, you might not get all the data that's out there, and so it might not be an accurate representation.